Good morning to everyone. It's an honor for us to be here, share with this panel this important topic that the phenomenon is not new, but it is a new topic of discussion and it has more strength lately. This is the fourth webinar in this webinar about fair financing organized by Latindadd, alongside with allies, global allies, and organized with climate justice and SID International. We'll be speaking about financialization of public policies, agriculture, gender demystifying solutions based on markets. The context of this is to discuss solutions from a system crisis to create conditions that will allow the establishment of an economy for people and social cultural rights. In this framework, we organized this webinar that will work on different topics, from conceptual topics, public policies, and topics that come directly, affect directly to people. From this event on, we'll have discussions that would allow us to see the future and to pose solutions from our own organizations and from the civil society. So today we thank you, those that are participating today with us, Daniela Gabor, Manuel Martinez, Lena Lavines, and Flora Sonkin. They're all eager to discuss and to work with us. We'll let you know that they will be, Manuel will speak in English and Portuguese and Spanish. So we'll let you know that you have the interpreting module, and so you can choose the language that you prefer. We welcome you, first of all, to Daniela Gabor. She's a professor of economy and finance of the University in Bristol, England. She has a PhD in finance and banking in Sterling, a master in development studies in Erasmus in Rotterdam, and she studied economy in Bucharest. Her line of investigation are central banking, monetary policy, macroprudential, and financial assets. She's really active in Twitter. So if you want to know about the news about this, you can follow her on Twitter. She's an excellent professional. So Daniela, you can start your presentation. Thank you. Thank you, Veronica, and thank you, Latindadd, for the invitation. I brought with me a PowerPoint because in economy, we always have to show. I don't know if you can see. And I apologize, even though I'm from Romania, and for us, it's very easy to speak Spanish. Unfortunately, I can speak faster about this in English, but when we get to questions and answers, I'll answer in Spanish. So,
I thought I should start today with a very brief outline of the Green Transition Plan announced by Brazil recently under the new Lula presidency, that in a sense hinges on the idea that Brazil needs to involve a lot of financing is needed for decarbonization, for a just transition, and because fiscal resources are not available to the extent that these financing needs require, then what Brazil needs to do is to partner with the private sector and to crowd in to attract private investment. And this to me is a very striking quote that from the Lula's chief of staff, that Brazil will encourage public-private partnerships, which is has a longer line and tradition even in previous governments. And very important that social responsibility does not mean fiscal responsibility. This is a very powerful line, and I think unpacking in the next 9 minutes, unpacking what I understand, what is the political economy or the politics behind this, is really interesting. And I don't want to do this in a sense to condemn or to discard the Brazil's green transition plans, but simply to alert to the fact that behind the constraints that exist for countries like Brazil and countries in the global south, constraints that come from the specific nature of global capitalist production and global finance, there are pathways, or there are ways in which decarbonization and the decarbonization choices that these countries make, they can take, I would suggest, a wrong turn. I'm not arguing that Brazil will take this wrong turn. There is a lot to be discussed there, but I want to trace some commonalities between what Brazil is doing and what I have, or what Brazil plans to do, and what I have termed the Wall Street consensus, which is a way of thinking about what comes after the Washington consensus. We in the global south have lived with, I've grown up with the Washington consensus. It was this idea of, you have to privatize, you have to liberalize, you have to stabilize through very severe monetary and fiscal austerity, the kind of consensus that was pushed by the World Bank, the IMF, and many other international organizations we all know. And we have moved from this idea of the Washington consensus to a new version, which says in order to achieve public policy priorities described by the Sustainable Development Goals or otherwise, we need to partner with private capital. We need to crowd in private capital. We need to attract investment in public policy priorities. The word financialization is not used, but we will see that that is another way to think about it. And because the alternative, the traditional alternative that we know, which is direct public investment, is not available. There are not sufficient fiscal resources to do public investment in whatever we think is necessary for a just transition, for example. So we have to de-risk or crowd in private finance. And this is the word that this narrative you would have heard 5 years ago at the World Bank. You would have heard it last week at the annual meetings of the World Bank and the IMF. The new president of the World Bank very explicitly suggests that when the World Bank is pushing for a larger balance sheet, it wants to leverage more private investment. It wants to catalyze more private investment into policy priorities. And what does this logic of catalyzing or partnering with private capital do? It says, in order to get more schools, better education, better hospitals, better infrastructure, renewable energy markets, protection for forests, protection for nature, what we need to do is to make sure that we make all these investable asset classes. In other words, we make them attractive for private capital, for institutional investors like BlackRock in the US, or for institutional investors like Brazilian pension funds. The idea is we have to make this investable, and to do so, we ask, why aren't these priorities already investable? Why isn't a Brazilian pension fund investing, for example, in renewable energy? And the answer is the risk and return profile is wrong for the mandate of these investors. Either risks are too high or returns are too low. So what we have here is the state coming in, or multilateral development banks coming in and saying, I will take some risks away, I will assume and compensate you for some risks, so your returns, your risk-adjusted returns, look better, and this investment opportunity is more attractive to you, okay? And I have here a couple of examples. First, this is Kenya's largest private wind company called the wind power, called the Lake Turkana wind power project. This is a private producer of renewable energy through onshore wind. And what we see here is the kind, when the World Bank says, or when the Brazilian presidency says, let's make wind power investable, what they mean is that you will get a constellation of public actors, either national or international, that will give some guarantees and some subsidies to the private operator of this energy company. Oh, sorry, it moved on. So there will be subsidies, there will be the guarantees in order to make such a project investable. And here I have I'm just showing you a list of the multilateral development institutions that gave subsidies to this particular operator. The development agencies in the global north, in Norway, Denmark, Finland, in the UK, that ended up first supported this investable project and then ended up selling their equity share, the part, you know, the equity issued by this company. They sold them to BlackRock, whose climate finance partnership is, for example, partly funded by the Hewlett Foundation in the US and by Germany and France through their official development aid. On the other side, we also have the Kenyan government, who said, besides all the guarantees and subsidies that you're receiving from these international development agencies, I will also guarantee price and demand for the output that you're producing. In other words, this is like not a lot like capitalism, in the sense that this private producer in the renewable energy market gets price and quantity guarantees. Usually capitalism is about competing in the market and improving your ability to produce better and to sell better than other investors. And I have several other examples of this. Is the same logic of directing subsidies and guarantees for a series of social and other infrastructure goods that become investable, which are generating private returns for international investors, including, for example, the forest is a big one now. And the idea is always, if you want to make, for example, forests investable or biodiversity, if you want to protect nature, what you have to do is to give or generate demand, to give guarantees, to generate profit for private investors. This is what is at stake in the financialization of nature, and the financialization of social goods. And I'm going to finish in 1 minute with why is this a problem? And there are three things, the three areas that I usually think of when I ask myself, why is this discourse of crowding in private capital a problem? The first one is there are coordination failures, and we see them in the US Inflation Reduction Act and in other places, is that basically this is a way of saying private capital is in charge, is in the driving seat, is deciding the pace and nature of decarbonization or of social policy priorities. Then there is the problem, and many people here on this call will know or are very close to the debates around mandatory involvement in debt restructuring for countries in the global south. We cannot generate political support for mandatory involvement, even from governments of countries in the global south, because the imperative of market access is much more important. They'd rather divert fiscal resources from education, from health, into paying bond investors or these private investors that it wants to crowd in, because they don't want to lose market access. And this is, I think, why we don't have a sovereign debt crisis in most countries in the global south, because the imperative of market access is so powerful these days. The third one, which is very important to me, I think, is to think about the distributional failures, because here we have the gendered nature of this financialization agenda, which is that we are seeing this is a Trojan horse for the privatization of a growing number of public goods, whereby the only way to get access to these public goods is either to pay user fees for hospitals or education or highways or public transport, et cetera, and also these projects sucks increasing fiscal resources that could be directed to public investment. And this is important because public provision is critical for addressing gender imbalances, because there are alternatives to partnerships with private capital. And in these alternatives, the state takes control and it disciplines private capital into its own strategic priorities. It doesn't bribe it to do the things that the state could do in other scenarios. Okay, I've left a couple of things here to read that are easier than my academic work, from two kind of blog posts. we've done with a colleague from Senegal, Ndongo Sambasila. Happy to take questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Daniela. We're going to continue with the 4 presentations, and you can write your questions down or comments in the Q&A box or in the chat, and we'll have a final discussion at the end. Now we invite Manuel Martinez. He's an economist. He's a candidate for PhD in economic development from the University of Brazil. He's a professor of theory and economic policy of the National University of Colombia and advisor of the Treasury Finance. He's an investigator and teacher in international policies, economic development, Latin American economy, monetary and financialization, and markets. So Manuel, thank you for accepting this invitation, and go on. Thank you so much for inviting me. For me, this is really an honor to share this panel with professors that have always been a great reference and influence in my training formation and my professional career. Especially, of course, Lina, who was a professor. The other day, we're speaking about that with the vice minister of the Ministry of Finance. And so with Daniela Gaor, that from her approximations and her academic contributions, she contributed to my professional training. So I'm going to make a presentation that's really short. I'd like to that you confirm that you can watch my presentation. Yes. So basically, I wanted to present a tosin which is being studied every time with more frequency. What has to do with financialization, especially before other countries, which in literature is known as subordinate financialization, and which could be understood as financial dominance of public finances, which I believe it's very important in this experience that we're having in an alternative government in Colombia to see which are those limitations that we find with more structure and complex to understand from what you might think of. So financialization and subordinate financialization, the concept of financial dominance in public finance. Third, I propose that we see quickly financialization of public debt and financial restriction in subordinate countries. And finally, to analyze the limits to the democratic development in those countries. So to start, just to mention some things that you know, for example, the concept of financialization as a systemic pattern of richness, which has to do, this is a structural aspect of the world markets, and it has its characteristics and expansion in flexibility and liquidity of richness in a permanent process of value, which is based on the centralization and concentration of capital. This is a definition that I really love because it's really broad and it gathers many of the transcendental elements of the financialization process. It comes from a professor Braga from Unicampi. There's another aspect that I believe it's relevant for this presentation, and it's understanding that the fictitious capital is the one that commands this accumulation, capital accumulation, and it's where we have every time it's more important that decisions, the expenditure decisions, inflation, deflation of assets, generating a greater instability, which is intrinsic to capitalism, which will have implications in the prices of the financial assets. Regarding subordinate financialization, what we refer to is the specific way in which this financial integration is presented in the periphery in this international system, and that's conditioned to accumulation dynamics by its level of subordination, and so the asymmetrical accumulation that this economy or these economies have in the system. And there is a growing literature that many colleagues of Daniela are working on this, as Alami, as Kartenbrunner, among others, that they posed that the definition of financial integration refers or it has some, it's important within the financialized capitalism and the internationalization of capital circuits where finance play a transcendental role in the extraction, transference, and value, not as a current, it, it's a characteristic that's present in economies and peripheral economies, but also as with a historical aspect and that has a uneven geographical development of the peripheral countries. So having this in mind of financialization, we can go to understand what is the dominant financial dominance. In literature, dominant, traditional, and mainstream, we're speaking about there's been a debate between the fiscal dominance and financial dominance, which is a dilemma because during financialization, what dominates, in fact, it's the financial over public finances. But just to let it clear, what do I mean by fiscal dominance and financial dominance? What the traditional literature poses is that fiscal dominance is when the central bank loses autonomy over the control of inflation, given that there's insustainability in public finance. So somehow the fiscal authority is the one that imposes increasing debt to finance, let's say, the public expenditure. And so on the other side of monetary dominance, what we understand is the central bank is the one that establishes and takes the role of taking economic policy. And so fiscal authorities adjust to the demands or to the needs of financing and sustainability of debt. They adjust to the central bank. So in practical terms, the ones that pose this dilemma, what we consider is that within this neoliberalism, the best is going to be to always have monetary dominance because that's the one that allows a sustainability of debt and a better control of inflation. And this way, we comply the two mandates of economic policy. On the monetary policy, we control inflation, and by the fiscal policy, we control deficits, public deficits, and we have a sustainability of debt as a consequence of the control of these two fundamental aspects. This is in the ideal world. This is the conventional theory, the neoclassic school, the new macroeconomical consensus, but with an alternative vision, which is the one that I propose on top of many studies that we did about it, is that in financialization, in fact, we don't have neither fiscal dominance nor monetary dominance. What we have in practice is a financial dominance of public finance, which means to a generalization of the monetary dominance to a scale in which institutional structures from the government and as the regulation of the economy, they are conditioned by the power of finance. And this is because financial dominance is done in benefit and benefits the accumulation of equity of some stakeholders, which are very important, very powerful, that are around the operations and the financial instruments that the government has to manage that and finance budget. And of course, this will become like a fiscal policy that will become a tool of correction of some on something that's not sustainable but has to do with the monetary policy. And this is expressed in fiscal austerity that doesn't consider the social rights in the population. In this sense, you might understand what is the financialization of public debt. First of all, something that we know already, and that's daily in our countries. There's a greater number of the public budget which has to do with paying interest and reducing debt that's in favor of those creditors, and that they reduce the fiscal space for the functioning of the state and especially for public investment. Second, it's expressed always by a differential, always positive differential between the interest rate, between the inflation rate. In the case of the peripheral countries, there's a financial spread between the interest rates of emerging countries regarding the interest rates of the USA. And this would allow us to have always a profitability to the creditors, private creditors, and national and foreign creditors that will benefit from this gap. And it's the private creditors, it's what Daniela mentioned, which are commercial banks, financial pension funds, very important in our countries, international investment funds that every time have more relevance in this asset and bonds markets, and foreign agents that demand a trust, they demand. So it means that in the constitutions, they have many of their demands in terms of discipline of fiscal policies in countries. So let's say this is expressed through the analysis of sustainability of debt. That means the relationship of debt regarding GDP and the primary balance, the primary results. Then let's say this is the deficit fiscal deficit discounting interest of debt. And starting there, we establish some rigid rules of fiscal rules that limit the acting of fiscal policy in those countries. So this has an effect in terms of, let's say, austerity has effects in growth, the distribution of income, richness, and the guarantees of human rights, which are imposed by this austerity. Just to give you data, this is the data from CEPAL, the total service of public policy as a percentage of income of central governments is relatively high, really high in some cases like Haiti, Mexico, Brazil, Panama, Argentina. There are other countries that are like in an intermediate level. In the case of Colombia, it's 36.3% if you count interest and reducing capital. But in general, we see with a high proportion of this of paying interest and amortization of debt. So this shows that every time we have less space for public investments required to continue with development. And the other aspect has to do with external financial restriction and the effects in public finance. So just to quickly mention, the subordinate financialization transforms the way in which the external restrictions are done. Let's say that's been developed by the CEPAR economists in their time. But when we're speaking about financialization, this external restriction is more relevant in the aspect, in the monetary and financial aspect, that even the more, and they keep their external restrictions, they keep demonstrating symmetry but in the monetary and financial sphere, it has more relevance, or the relationships, economical, international relationships are conditioned to dollar as the world currency in terms of as a reference or reserve currency, so establishes some conditions for the financial relationships and debt internationally. And for the peripheral countries, this is a determining factor. So because external in debt is nominated in dollars or public in debt is in local currency, it could be requested by foreign investors. So that makes the fluctuations of exchange rates have effects in the way in which the internal debt is managed. And these fluctuations are given in part due to changes in monetary policies of central banks, increase or decrease of interest rates by central banks, or, or by the preference of the liquidity of investors. And so here, this is expressed in two ways. One, with, let's say, one limitation in economical policies of peripheral countries, that the monetary policy is expressed the low capacity of central banks to stimulate credit and demand because interest rates are subject to compensate the lack of liquidity regarding central countries to guarantee a valuation of financial richness. And by the fiscal policy side, it has limit to exchange rates that have a mechanism of transmissions through the risk indices. Every time that there's a depreciation of the exchange rate, for example, is translated into an increase of risk in economy, and it could be translated to unfit of currencies, of exchange rates, or other problems of vulnerability or financial instability that will be affected by these movements. So this is just to consider the number of internal creditors that we have in Latin American economies. At least this is significant in the case of Mexico, Brazil. If Brazil has a debt in high eyes, Portuguese currency, I was as most of their debt are in Brazilian currency, but there's a small proportion of external creditors. But then the same that's happening in Colombia, where we have a high participation of foreign investors, or Ecuador, Salvador, where they have a greater participation of foreign creditors, which limit the monetary and fiscal policy. And just to show this relationship between the interest rates and the risk indices, here we have some series for Colombia, Brazil, and Mexico between 2008 and 2023, and where we see that even though the exchange rates are indexed, we can see that the periods in which we increased the risks, it could be associated with exchange shoots, where we had a high devaluation of exchange rates. And this is one way of, let's say, those international shocks to public finance. Every time that there's international shocks, this could be translated between the exchange rate. This increases the risk perception, and it makes the cost of debt increases. It reduces the capacity of expenditure, public expenditure in the economy, and this could be conditioned to problems of second round problems as where the state has to compensate for those kind of losses. And finally, I just wanted to mention that this policy, like I mentioned before, they are conditioned by through financialization of debt, and that this is manifested through fiscal and monetary austerity. There's like three elements that are fundamental to mention that in the peripheral countries are presented as, say, leverage shirt to try to, so this straight jacket is manifested in the rigid rules the central banks, and they want to determine, and the scrutiny of risk agencies, like not only to the one they add to the restrictions that I mentioned, but there's also a restriction by public economy that's mainly by the risk qualifying agencies that they add pressure to the system. The other aspect has to do with austerity, fiscal austerity aspects. There's negative effects in terms of growth, investment, salaries, and the guarantee of human rights. But also there's an effect that's being explored, and the effect that the democratic systems have is that austerity is linked to some political parties that are extremists and popular, and that execute policies that limit and vulnerate economical, social, and environmental rights of population, which is a danger not only for the economical behavior, but also for the population where they apply these kind of measures. This is my presentation. I'm sorry if it took me too long. Thank you. Thank you, Manuel. Now we invite Lena Lavina. She's economic professor of the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro. She has she studied she has a master's and doctorate in the high studies of Latin America from the University of Paris, Sorbonne. Her lines of studies have to do with social protection, specifically in the financialization processes of social policy. Thank you for accepting the invitation, Lena. Go on.
Muito obrigada. Eu vou falar português. Eu quero agradecer muito o convite para estar aqui hoje. É uma alegria
On the
estar com
Flora that they
Manuel e
didn't
com a
know,
Flora que eu não conhecia,
Daniela,
com a
who I
Daniela que eu
admire a
admiro muito,
lot,
com
and
as
the
colegas
Feminist College.
feministas.
The
A
presentation that
apresentação
I'll
que eu vou
do
fazer, eu vou tentar
quickly
fazê-la
will
rapidamente, vai ter
have
um
a
foco no
focus on
Brasil,
Brazil, but I want
mas o
to
que eu vou
show you
tentar
the big
mostrar é a grande mudança
change
que a
that we
gente
had
teve no que diz
regarding the
respeito à
understanding of
compreensão do que é a
social
política
policy
social sobre
and
a dominância financeira. Então, é
financial
importante
dominance.
entender
It's
que
important
antes
to
a gente
understand that
tinha
in
a
the past,
ideia
social
da política
policy
social,
or
do
the
sistema de
protection
proteção social, como alguma
something that
coisa que
was going to
ia
contribute
contribuir para
to
proteger ao
protect
longo do ciclo de vida todos os indivíduos.
with
Havia
different
distintas modalidades
modalities
de
of provision,
provisão, a provisão
provision
in
in
kind,
kind
né,
through
através de
services,
serviços desmercantilizados, era
and
importante nos
advanced
países mais
countries less
avançados,
important for
menos
countries
importante
in
nos países em
development. But the
desenvolvimento,
logic
mas
is
a
that
lógica é
everything was
que isso
built
tudo foi construído
from
a
the
partir
panels that we
justamente do
spoke
que a gente
about
chamou
public
fundo
funding,
público e
and this is what we
aquilo que a
call
gente chamou a
social property,
propriedade social,
which
que
explained the
explicava a existência
existence of
dos
the regimes
regimes,
of
né,
public
de repartição
debt,
pública, saúde
public
pública,
health,
etc. E
etc.
mesmo se
Even if this
esse
model
modelo
wasn't
não se
implemented in all
implementou em todos os
places,
lugares, muito menos nos países em
this
desenvolvimento,
was the
esse
idea
era
of
o
social
ideal de
protection.
proteção social.
With
Com a
financialization, there's a
financialização, existe uma
profound
mudança profunda,
change
porque
because
a financialização
financialization
justamente vai
goes
transbordar sobre a
through
esfera da
social
reprodução
reproduction.
social.
So I
E eu
believe it's
acho que é
important to
importante
understand
entender
two
duas
dimensions.
dimensões.
One
Uma é que
is that
o endividamento vai
debt
ser
will
aquilo que
be
vai se
generalized as
generalizar como
a form
forma
to
de
access
acesso ao
well-being, and
bem-estar.
the
E
second
a segunda
is that
coisa
we'll have
é que a
new
gente
social
vai ter
actors
novos atores sociais provendo
providing
serviços,
services,
e
and
isso
this
vai se dar
will be
através
given
justamente da
through
busca
the
deles
looking for them
por
to have
ter
more financial
ganhos financeiros,
gains
ganhos
that
esses que
come
são
from
derivados
property of
da
capital
propriedade do
and not
capital e
really
não
from
propriamente
production
da produção.
And I
E eu acho
believe
que a
that
financialização
financialization
se
is
explica,
explained
sobretudo,
especially
por
about
isso,
this
dentro da
within
lógica
this
rentista,
logic where we
onde há
have new
novas
ways
formas de
to
obtenção
have
de rendas, de lucros
derived from property
derivados da
and not from the
propriedade,
production.
não da
So
produção.
quickly, I
Então,
want
quero
to show
rapidamente
some
mostrar
cases in
alguns casos no
Brazil
Brasil que mostram a profunda
that show
transformação,
you the
metamorfose da
metamorphosis of
política social. Isso
public
aqui é para
policy. This
mostrar
is
para
to
vocês
tell you
como é
how
que, ao longo dos
during
anos
the 2000s
2000,
and in
e em
particular
particular
after
depois da
the
chegada do
PT
governo do
government,
PT,
we had a
nós tivemos um
process
processo de
of
crescente
growth
endividamento das
of debt
famílias.
in
Vocês
families.
veem aí, isso é um dado do
These
Banco
are
Central, em
from
2005,
central bank,
menos de
from the
17% da renda das
income of
famílias
families
estava
that had to
comprometido
do
com o
with
pagamento de dívida,
debt
e nós
payment,
temos
and
hoje
now
alguma
we have
coisa que
something
chega
that
aí à
gets to
ordem de
50%.
50%, sendo que, segundo
I
o
understand that
próprio
according
Banco
to the central
Central, ao final
bank,
de
at the end of
2021,
2021,
havia
there was 85
85,5
million
milhões de
in debt,
adultos endividados,
almost half
praticamente
of the
metade da
population,
população,
and many
e
of
muitos deles
them
altamente
really had high
endividados.
debt.
Isso
This
aconteceu na
condition
medida em que houve uma maior
is
oferta de
because
crédito
there's
das
better
famílias. O
offers of
crédito sempre
credits
foi
to
uma parcela
families.
muito pequena do
There's
PIB
always been a
brasileiro
part of the
até os
family
anos
from the
2000.
2000s. It was
Foi
necessary
necessário, evidentemente,
a
um
stabilization
processo de
process,
estabilização
but
macroeconômica,
there's a
mas
whole
existe toda uma
change
mudança, né, na
in the
lógica
accumulation. The
da
accumulation
acumulação, e a
is
acumulação
increasing,
elitista vai
but
crescendo,
this
mas esse
graph is
gráfico é
important to
importante para
show that
mostrar que quando
when
a
we
gente
compare
compara
the
o
credit
estoque de
stock that was given
crédito
to
que foi dado
families,
às famílias,
which
que
is
é a linha
the
vermelha, e que
line
foi
in
dado
red,
às
and when
empresas,
we
que é a
see the
linha azul, a
green
gente vê que a partir de
line
2016,
from
o
2016,
estoque de
the credit
crédito é
stock was
maior
bigger
para
for
as
Brazilian
famílias
families than
brasileiras do que
for companies.
propriamente para as
This
empresas,
means
o
that
que quer
it's
dizer
the
que
families the
são as
ones that
famílias que vão
guarantee the
garantir a
profitability
rentabilidade
of
dos
investments
investimentos
and
enfim,
the
dos
gains of the
lucros
financial
do
sector of
setor
banks.
financeiro e dos
And it's
bancos.
important to
E
say,
é bom
just to
dizer, só para
remind you,
lembrar,
that
que
in
no
Brazil,
Brasil,
90% of
90% das novas
our credit
concessões de
conditions from
crédito desde
2015, from
2015, desde
2012 on,
2012,
are given
se
by
dão com crédito de
consumption
consumo e não
credit
com mortgage,
and not
crédito
real estate
imobiliário, que
credit that would
permitiriam o
allow
acesso das
families
famílias
to have
a ativos.
greater
O ativo
assets
maior que
that will
existe em
have,
mãos das famílias é a moradia,
as
como a
we all
gente
know.
sabe. Mas o que é interessante
So
mostrar é que quando veio justamente a
when we had
Covid,
COVID,
a gente vê
we
aqui,
see the
são
two
essas duas
lines, the
linhas, a linha
red,
vermelha são os
we
atrasos no
have
pagamento, menos de 90
loans
dias,
past
e a
due,
linha negra é o grau
and
de
the one
inadimplência
in
das famílias brasileiras. E
black
em
is the
2020,
influence of
quando se
Brazilian
adotam, né,
families.
aquelas
In
medidas ad
2020,
hoc
when we
muito
adopt
generosas
these
de se
generous
transferir
measures to transfer
inúmeros,
big
montante
numbers of
grande de
resources to
recursos
families,
às
what
famílias,
families
o que fazem
do,
as famílias
highly
altamente
in debt
endividadas e
families,
também com
and
altos
with
níveis de
greater levels of
inadimplência?
problems
Apesar do
despite the
alto
unemployment,
desemprego, apesar da
despite
insegurança alimentar,
the
elas correm
food
para os
insecurity,
bancos,
they run to the
e isso
banks.
explica
This
que
explains
você
that in
tenha,
April
em abril de
2020, when the
2022, quando o
government,
governo do então presidente, né,
when they had
negacionista,
Bolsonaro as president,
Bolsonaro,
would
resolve
try to
garantir,
guarantee or
fazer
to,
transferências importantes às
there's a big
famílias, tem uma
drop
grande
of
queda da inadimplência,
finance.
perdão. E essa
And
grande
this
queda
big
da
drop
inadimplência
lasted for
dura
a
alguns
month
meses, porque as
because
famílias
the
correm para
families
os
were going to
bancos
the bank
para
to
reduzir a
reduce
sua inadimplência e
their
poder
debt,
se reendividar
and so
além.
that
E
they
logo,
could
logo a gente vê
have
que
a
há um
new debt.
aumento da
And
inadimplência e
that's why
também um
there's a
aumento
new
no atraso dos
increase.
pagamentos. Não, por acaso, o
That's
governo
why
Lula
Lula
chega e, além
came,
de
and
apostar nas
on the show
PPPs,
it
como
in the
disse a
PPTs.
Daniela, está lançando o
They
maior
have a
programa social
social
que o
program
Brasil já
that's
teve. Não
bigger.
é mais o Bolsa Família, que
It's not
foi
devoted to
reinstituído,
families, but
mas é um programa
it's a program
chamado
that's called
Desenrola
to
Brasil,
enroll
cujo
Brazil.
foco é não no
It's not
endividamento
about
das
family
famílias, que
debts,
continua crescendo, mas em reduzir o
but
grau
it's
de
about reducing
inadimplência,
the degree
que
of influence
hoje atingiria
that now would
70
reach 70
milhões de
million
brasileiros
Brazilians
que estariam
that
inadimplentes
are
ou tendo
defaulters or
pagamentos em
that have
atraso.
overdue
E o que
payments.
é interessante? Para aqueles que
For
ganham
those that
até
have up to
dois
two
salários
monthly
mínimos, que é
minimum
alguma
wages,
coisa como
around
US$ 500,
$500,
o Estado
the state
vai
assumes a
participar da
renegotiation. They will
renegociação,
create
vai
a
criar um fundo
fund that
garantidor de
guarantees credit for
crédito
the
para os
banks.
bancos.
Banks are
Os
going to
bancos vão
freely
negociar
negotiate
livremente
with
com
those that are
aqueles que estão
in fault.
endividados. Ele vai
They will
negociar
negotiate
a
debt.
dívida, o valor da dívida, vai ser
They're going to
redefinido um
define the new
novo
value of
valor
debt.
de dívida e
And in the
caso
case of
este
Brazilians
brasileiro,
that
né,
this
endividado,
they come back
volte
to
ficar
be
inadimplente, ou
and at
seja, pare
fault.
de pagar a sua
So the
dívida agora,
government,
aí o governo
through a
brasileiro, através de um fundo garantidor
fund,
de crédito,
is
vai
going to pay the
pagar,
bank
o banco vai
the
pagar o
principal
principal corrigido
corrected by
pela
the elite,
Selic, que hoje está
which
em
is right now 12,
12,75%, aquilo que o
75%.
brasileiro deve ao banco. Ou seja,
So
para
to go back
voltar para
with
as
what we
coisas
spoke
disse a
with Daniela,
Daniela,
it's really
é
a
realmente
way
uma
that
forma
I want
de
to
eu querer
expand again access to
expandir
credit,
de novo o acesso a
guaranteeing that
crédito,
banks
garantindo
won't
que os
have
bancos não
risks,
vão ter
and
risco e
trying
tentando
to
enxugar o grau de inadimplência dos brasileiros. Eu quero
cover
só
the
lembrar
degree
que
of
para esses
debt
muito
of
pobres que
Brazilians.
ganham menos de
So poor countries
US$ 530
that
por
earn
mês,
less than
a
$500 per
taxa
month,
de juros
the
ao
interest rate
ano
per year
sobre
on
os
new debt
novos,
or
as
negotiated
dívidas
debt will
renegociadas
be
vai ser de
27%,
27%,
27% yearly
27% ao ano,
when current
quando a atual
inflation is
inflação, a taxa de
5%.
inflação é
Just to
5%.
tell you
É só para
that
dizer que
we
a gente
continue
continua
transferring resources
transferindo
for the
recursos
banking
para
sector.
o setor bancário, não é isso?
So here I want to show
E
you
aqui é para mostrar, eu vou
to
pedir para
see
vocês
the graph
olharem o gráfico
on
do
the
lado
right,
direito do slide,
the
que o
Brazilian state
Estado brasileiro, o governo
about
brasileiro,
the
sob a
left
gestão da
management.
esquerda,
They conceived
concebeu
a
um
new
novo
framework to
framework
reduce
para
the
reduzir
levels
os
of
níveis de
default
inadimplência e
and to boost
incentivar
household
a
credit,
ampliação do crédito, tá certo?
renegotiating debt
Renegociando dívidas
through
através justamente
a program
de um programa onde
where
o
where
Estado
the
é o
state
garantidor.
as a
Isso nunca tinha
guarantor.
acontecido antes no Brasil, isso não fazia parte
This
do
never
nosso
happened in
esquema de
Brazil.
proteção
It
social,
was
e
never
é isso que a
part
gente
of our
vê
culture. This is what we're
acontecendo
seeing
aqui.
here.
Eu quero rapidamente
We're
mostrar
going
o
to
que
see
se
what's
passa
happening
também na
in
saúde e
health
na
and
educação.
education. I believe that I
Eu
have
acho que
some
ainda
minutes
tenho
left.
alguns minutos.
Education
A
and health
educação e a
have
saúde
always been
sempre
a
foram, em
big
grande parte,
part
privadas no
private
Brasil.
in
Havia
Brazil. There
uma
was a
produção
public production,
pública
there was enough
insuficiente, deficiente,
of
de qualidade, enfim,
questionable quality, but the
questionável.
private
E o setor
sector
privado antes estava
was
na mão de
enhanced and
grandes
big
famílias,
families, rich
famílias
families
ricas que
that
foram
got
enriquecendo
richer
através da
over
venda de
time
serviços.
through
Mas
selling
isso
services.
mudou. O que
But
a
this was
gente tem
changed
hoje
now.
são
Now we
grandes
have big
grupos
groups that
que abriram
opened that
capital
are
em bolsa de
listed
novo. A
in
partir de
the
2004, o mercado de
exchange
capitais era
market.
muito pequeno no Brasil.
It
Cresce
grew
muito
really
durante essa
this
fase de
financialization
financiarização
stage that
que
introduced
introduz
the
o governo
PT
PT na
government under their
sua
management
gestão,
and the
já
first
no
mandate
primeiro
of
mandato
Lula
do presidente Lula.
president.
E a
And
gente
here
vê
we
aqui,
see in the green
nas
boxes
caixas
and red
verde e
boxes
vermelha,
that
a partir
since
da
COVID,
Covid,
we
eu tenho
have
uma nova
a new round
onda
of
de
capitals
abertura de capital,
where
onde
companies
as empresas de saúde que ainda não tinham aberto capital vão abrir
and
capital e também
also
as empresas de
education,
educação
higher education
superior.
companies.
Então, quem
So
controla o
who's
capital
fun?
dessas empresas,
So in the
que
past, they were
antes eram
rich
famílias muito
families,
ricas, como a Fleury, a
as
Dasa,
Basa,
olhando aqui a
seen on the
coluna da
left,
esquerda,
or
o
Alicorp.
Alicorp. Agora,
Now we
a gente
see
vê pela
on the second
coluna, a
column on the
segunda coluna à
left that
esquerda,
a big
que
part
grande
of the
parte, né,
control of
do
these
controle
companies
acionário dessas
are in hands
empresas
of
está nas mãos de fundos de
stake
private
private
equity.
equity
Para
funds,
citar o BlackRock aqui, mencionado
which is
pela
something
Daniela,
BlackRock, as
mas
Daniela
muitos
mentioned, but
outros. E não
others
é
as
uma
well.
coisa marginal, é um
It's a
percentual
high
muito alto.
percentage
É
of what
aquilo que eu
I
falei,
said is
são
payments
pagamentos
of
de
dividends,
dividendos e, enfim,
of
de juros que
interest that
serão
will be
feitos
paid
a
to
essas
those
empresas
companies that
que
now
hoje têm
take
controle
control of
acionário nas
shares
mãos dos
in the
fundos
hands of
de
private
private
equity
equity
and
e dos
the
investidores
institutional investors.
institucionais. Bom, isso
This
levou
took
a
to
uma
a
mudança
change
também do
in the
ponto de
point of
vista
view
do
of
papel
the
das chamadas health
geotax in
techs no
Brazil.
Brasil. A
We
gente tem
had
uma
a violent
expansão violenta
expansion
nos últimos 3 anos
for the
das
past
plataformas de
telemedicine,
telemedicina,
which
né,
also
que
reflects
também
the
refletem um processo de grande concentração de capital como o mercado de
reconfiguration.
Noel. A gente vê
For
que, por
example, we have
exemplo, eu
two big
tenho dois
programs.
grandes programas aqui,
They're new
duas
companies
novas
that
empresas
are
que são
exclusive of
exclusivamente de
telemedicine,
telemedicina,
created in
criadas há
just
pouco tempo. Uma delas, a
very
Health Tech
recently. One of
Alice,
them
que
is
está
Health
do
Tech Alice,
lado
which is on the right
direito do
side,
slide,
created in
criada em
2020
2020, e ela é financiada
from
por quem?
mergers and
Por grandes
acquisitions,
fundos
benefited by big
internacionais, a
international funds,
SoftBank, Kazesk, Thornbury Capital
SoftBank,
Partners, que
Kazakh,
tem milhares
which
hoje
there's
de
many
brasileiros que
millions of
buscam esse
Brazilians that
serviço, que
pay
pagam as
the
tarifas que forem
necessary
necessárias
amounts
em razão da
to have
deficiência
this
da
benefit.
provisão pública. A uma
The same
coisa acontece
happens
no
with
ensino
higher
superior. O
education.
ensino superior no Brasil, ele sempre teve a característica de ser
Brazil
fortemente
had
privatizado.
the
Só
characteristic
para
of being
vocês verem
highly
aqui, né,
privatized.
que em
In 2020,
2020,
70% of undergraduate
77% de
students
todos os estudantes universitários brasileiros
enrolled in
estavam
private
em
universities.
empresas privadas
They
que
were paying for
pagavam por
those.
isso, tá certo? Então, isso foi
And
crescendo.
88%
88%
of
de
all
todas as
universities in Brazil
universidades
are private,
brasileiras são privadas
and
e
they are
são de
second
segunda
quality. They
qualidade,
aren't
não
as
são tão
good
boas quanto
as
as
public
universidades
universities.
públicas,
But
mas
in
em
2007, the
2007 o
government
governo, então,
created
resolveu para
to
criar
create
inclusão
social
social, o
inclusions
governo do Partido dos Trabalhadores resolveu criar,
this
ampliar um programa de
political party
financiamento
created a
amplo para as
financial
empresas privadas
program
para
so
poder
that
fazer com que
they wanted to increase the
aumentasse
percentage
o
of
percentual
students
de alunos
that would go
que
to
iam
private
para
universities to
universidades
show
privadas
that there
para
were
mostrar que havia
a
uma
democratization
democratização do
of
ensino
higher
superior.
education.
Mas a democratização do
But
ensino
this was really
superior foi bem
complex
complicada,
because as
à medida que
here the columns you can see in the
esses histograms
histograms
aqui, as
in the gray
colunas
column,
cinza,
the
aumentava o
enrollment number
número de
was decreasing,
matrículas, as
but
empresas de educação superior que
the
haviam
higher
aberto
education
capital em
companies that
bolsa,
had that
elas
were
conseguiam
listed on
ter
the
uma grande
exchange
valorização dos
markets, they
seus
had a
ativos,
great
das suas ações em bolsa,
number of
crescendo
their
muito acima da média
values,
da
increasing even
valorização
above the
dos ativos da
means.
B3, que é a empresa
So what
brasileira.
we see
E o que a
here
gente tem,
is
então,
that
com
we have
isso? A gente tem
another
uma
structural
outra mudança
change
estrutural. É que, na
because
medida
since
que, a partir de
2015,
2015, é suspenso o FIES, com a crise,
everything
a grande
was on
recessão que o
hold
Brasil
because of the
teve
crisis, the
também em
recession that Brazil
2016,
had
o impeachment
in
da presidente
2016,
Dilma, uma
Dilma
série de
impeachment.
problemas, as
And
empresas
so private
privadas
companies
começam
started to
elas mesmas
promote the
a
finance
promover, a
access
financiar o
to
acesso
higher
ao ensino
education. But
superior.
because it
Mas
was
como
too
ele é muito
expensive,
caro, com taxas, por
we had
exemplo, de
5% of the
5% ao
month,
mês, o
which
que é um
is really
absurdo,
so
fica tão
expensive
caro
that
que
people
os
that want to get
jovens que
into
querem
private
entrar nas
universities,
universidades privadas, em
because
razão de não
there's
haver
no
oferta
enough
suficiente na
offers
esfera
in the public
pública,
sphere
por
due to
causa das
austerity
políticas de
policies,
austeridade,
what
o que
people do
faz
is
os
that they
jovens,
see in
vocês veem aí que em
2020,
2020,
60,
60% de
70% of
todos
all
os brasileiros
Brazilians in
inscritos em
universities
universidades estão
are
em cursos de
are
distance learning,
studying
né? Mas
through
em
distance learning, but in 2022,
2022, isso já chegou a
this got to 72%.
72%. Ou seja, as
That means people
pessoas
don't have
não
a
estão tendo um
socialization
processo de
process
socialização de formação
of
em universidade de qualidade,
they don't
mas
have
muitas
quality
vezes, porque não
university
tem
because they
recurso,
don't have
elas
the
compram
resources. They
apenas
buy
um
one
curso,
course
uma disciplina,
and
e
they
vão
pay over
pagando
time
em vez
instead
de se
of
inscreverem,
enrolling
se
in a
matricularem num
career.
curso inteiro. Quem está por
What
dentro de
is in
todo
part
esse
of the system?
sistema, de novo,
Private equity
fundos de
funds, as
private
you can
equity,
see,
como
and
vocês estão vendo, e
again,
de novo tem lá não
we see
apenas
the
O
Jack
Chan Zuckerberg
Zuckerberg initiative,
Initiative, mas a
but we
gente
also
tem
have some
algumas das
companies
empresas que
that
fazem
are
parte
part of
daqueles
the
big trees,
big
né? Venture
trees.
capitalists. Ou seja,
So,
quem
who
decide
decides the social
desenhar
policy in
política
Brazil,
social no
even
Brasil,
though
ainda que na esfera
in the
privada, mas
private
impactando
sphere,
também na esfera pública,
it's a
são os
private equity
fundos de
funds, the
private
ones
equity,
that are
investidores
determining and
institucionais.
institutional
Então, para
investors.
concluir,
To
eu queria
finish, I
dizer
want
o
to say that
seguinte:
we
nós
have a
temos uma
novelty
novidade,
on top
além
of
daquilo que
what
disse a
Daniela said. I don't
Daniela,
have time
eu
to
não vou
continue
ter tempo de
here.
explorar aqui. O governo está
The government
lançando
is
também
launching the
social impact
social
bonds
impact
para
bond
atrair
to
investimentos,
expand
para expandir
investments, to use
recursos que
resources
possam
that could
melhorar, expandir a
expand the
cobertura da
coverage of
Bolsa
family,
Família, da
of food
Seguridade
safety,
Alimentar,
of
da
training,
capacitação da mão de obra, etc.
and
Ou
that
seja, o
money
governo vai
will
emitir títulos da ordem de 20
issue
bilhões
titles for
para
20
que
million
a gente
to have
tenha
contribution from the
aportes
financial
do setor
sector,
financeiro, o que
which finally
significa, em última
means
instância,
that
que nós
we're
estamos fazendo o quê?
making
Nós estamos
the
tirando a
public
política
policy
social
of
do
budget,
orçamento e a
and
estamos
we are
inscrevendo,
enrolling
né,
in the
nas
payrolls of banks
planilhas dos bancos
and
e
the
dos fundos
investment
de
funds.
investimento.
This
É
is what
disso que
it's
se
about.
trata. Ao
At the same
mesmo
time, we're
tempo,
seeing that the
a gente está
government
vendo que o governo agora
has
transformou
this
em política social
social
a
policy,
gestão da
debt
dívida das
management of
famílias, a
households.
dívida passa a
This would be
reconfigurar o
part of the
repertório
public
de
policies
políticas
repertoire,
públicas na esfera da reprodução social. Isso é uma
and this is something
total
new.
novidade, e
And
não
it's
se
not
trata
about
de
eliminating
eliminar o
debt,
endividamento, mas
but
trata-se de
the
tornar a
household
dívida
debt
das famílias algo
are
sustentável que
going
não
to be
coloque em xeque
sustained
o mercado financeiro.
by financial
Ao mesmo
markets. At the same
tempo, a
time, we'll
gente
have
vai cada
more
vez mais
mitigation
ter políticas
policies
de mitigação muito localizadas,
instead
em
of
vez de
having
ter
this
aquela visão
initial
inicial de
scope
uma
of a
proteção
protection
única
throughout
acima
life.
de vida,
And again, we have new stakeholders acting in this
setor da
reproduction
esfera da
sphere,
reprodução social, que
which are the
são
private
as
equity
firmas de private
firms
equity, os investidores
and other
institucionais,
institutions
que
that
vêm
are configuring
reconfigurando
the
por
nature
completo
of
a
social provision.
natureza da provisão social e,
And
evidentemente,
this
isso
will
vai se agravar
aggravate
ainda mais com a
everything.
questão da
Thank you so
transição
much.
verde. Muito obrigada.
Thank you, Elena. It's very impressive, the information that you give to us. And now I want to go to Flora Soking, which will present the links with food. She's responsible for public financing for development, international. She's a specialized investigator in formulating international policies about agriculture. She's worked on research on field about fights for land rights with rural people in Brazil. And she analyzed public policies and ecological projects in Spain. She also works with civil society organizations and social movements. Flora has a master's in science, international studies with a specialization in rural sociology from the University of Wageningen in the Netherlands. Go on, Flora. Thank you, Veronica and Carola, for this invitation. I'm from Brazil, but I'm going to speak in English to make this presentation. I'm sorry for my Brazilian colleagues. And it's a big pleasure for me to be with the other panelists, different people that learn a lot. And I'm given this investigation. So I'm thankful already to share here.
Okay, switching to English. I will try to do a brief presentation about something that is very complex. And so by no means this is a full overview of the topic, but I'm glad that the previous colleagues have helped already define some of the issues around financialization. And I would like to hone it down to this issue of financialization of food and agriculture. So in recent years, as we've been discussing here, the financial economy that's rooted in speculation and volatility, and as Daniela was saying, proliferating new asset classes has very much also infiltrated in the area of food and agriculture and expanded into new asset classes around natural resources. And an important trend around this has been the complete outstriping in size and pace of the financial economy versus the real economy, like Lena was talking about. So real economy meaning the production, incomes, employment, everything that generates real value into our lives and our economy. Financialization is coming in by generating financial value out of rentier capital. And this is this increased role and this increased power of financial actors, financial motives, and financial sector on this area of the economy is also very much determining the shape and design of macroeconomic investment and regulatory policy across countries and institutions all around the world. And in the case of agriculture, this is no different. I'm actually speaking right now from Rome, where global policy discussions at the Committee of World Food Security are happening. For those of you who are not familiar, the CFS is the main space for global food governance and international policy convergence on food and agriculture, and where tomorrow we'll be discussing the monitoring of policy recommendations on food price volatility, and where at the same time, donor countries are also pushing this narrative that Daniela was laying out on leveraging and crowding in private capital as the main solution for food systems transformation and as a way to fill this so-called financing for sustainable development gap, especially in the global south. So I've put together this scheme that seems quite complicated, but I guess it reflects the complexity of the issue. But I just, to begin with, wanted to give a little bit of background on where this financialization of food and agriculture, how did it come about? And it starts or is very much expanded through this deregulation and liberalization of the economy that we've seen, especially since the 80s and 90s, with World Bank and IMF policy prescriptions to countries that were needing aid. And so these countries basically, in exchange for the promise of receiving financial support, they had to lay out a series of policy reforms, and this comes from the idea that this unregulated markets would efficiently allocate economic resources in a way that maximizes countries and people's overall well-being. And this meant, in terms of package of economic policy reforms, that included fiscal consolidation, or this is the World Bank IMF name for austerity policies, the reduction of cross-border capital controls, trade liberalization, privatization of public services such as water supply or agricultural inputs and infrastructure provision, and other measures such as, for instance, allowing foreign investors ownership of natural resources. And the policies related to food and agriculture also opened up new markets for genetically modified seeds, facilitated the approval of chemical pesticides and fertilizers, and also contributed to changing countries' land tenure arrangements. For instance, countries that had a large history of commonly held land had projects that were promoted by the World Bank to create, for instance, private land titling schemes. And this was all under this idea of enhancing the productivity of land use. But a lot of evidence that has been put out from colleagues and people in different countries in the past years have actually shown that these market-led reforms have had very negative impacts on the loss of livelihoods for local communities. And this has for sure a differentiated impact on women, and a differentiated impact along the lines of gender, race, and class, and geographical location as well. But these reforms have very much benefited agribusiness investors, financial speculators, and we have seen, especially since the 2008-2009 global financial crisis, and also food spike crises, that there was a huge rush of the financial sector investors, such as asset managers, commercial banks, pension funds, trying to rush to the agriculture and food sector as a profitable investment opportunity. And this happened through commodity derivatives, large-scale speculative land investments, and this financial interest and motives, such as the increase in shareholder profits, began to further influence also how food systems are shaped. For instance, we see that with this increasing rush for private financial investment in food and agriculture businesses, a shift towards more a growing proliferation of food and agriculture tech businesses. And we see that the more these private financial interests and actors are rushing into the sector, there's also an increase in price volatility, an increase in how countries and people in the household level or farmers are also being affected by these external shocks, or by the definitions of prices that happen outside of their control. So in this sense, price in agriculture markets are not anymore being driven by offer and demand, but are being driven by trends that are and by behavior that is happening far from the land and far from where people are producing food, but actually being defined by the interests of financial actors and financial investments that are seeking the most profitable returns. So this deregulation and liberalization of the economy trend at the same time has also meant the reduction of the role of the state, and what Daniela was talking about with the Wall Street consensus, very much the role of the state becoming this de-risking actor. And so where historically smallholder farmers used to receive public support through subsidies, through public credits and agricultural insurance schemes. Now, in more recent years, we see the individualization of this risk and the reliance on commercial banks and more private insurance schemes to deal with these external shocks that they now are more open to and having a further impact on their everyday lives. And it's what is, I think, key here and very problematic is that at the same time that this trend of deregulation and of financialization is actually increasing price volatility and increasing the vulnerability to these external shocks, they are also providing more financial inclusion, so more reliance on private finance as the solution for the problems that this shift has created in the first place. And so when it comes to gender and the women's empowerment agenda, we see very much donor countries and international financial institutions promoting the, for instance, idea of microcredit, of financial inclusion as the panacea, as like the one-size-fits-all solution for much deeper issues that are leaving households increasingly indebted and also vulnerable to shocks that are much deeper, and for instance, the climate emergency and all these issues that global North countries have had a much higher impact in developing in the first place. And so as Lena was talking about, there is this increasingly higher trend of a larger household debt levels that in times of crises, when it comes to food sovereignty and food security, families will end up focusing on expanding on their most immediate needs, so food, and in this case, they will have to spend less on health and education. And when we're looking through a feminist economy lens or a gender perspective, this also means a much higher burden for women who end up taking the extra care work that is not being provided by the state and that their household income is not being able to pay for. So this is one of the examples of the gendered impact of this trend. Another, I think, more recent issue that relates to the financialization of the food and agriculture sector is also this platformization or Uberization of work. And when it comes to food retail, we have seen, and you can pass on the next slide as well. Yes, thank you. When it comes to the financial sector interest in this, we see this huge boom of the platform economy, and what also translates to this more precarious work for women. And here there's an example of some companies, and this, so then it's more of a private equity discussion, but companies that have been receiving a lot of private investments in recent years. So a boom on, for instance, DoorDash, Instacart, all these different food retailing companies that bring food directly to consumers, and who have been growing increasingly and have received this boom of financial interest, but that have translated into very precarious work for women and for people in general. So where the wealth is very much reinvested into the shareholder value, but is not really translated to the workers. You can pass on the next slide as well, Veronica. Here's another, I guess, example of how this trend of concentrating wealth into the financial sector bubble and reducing wealth from labor is showing up increasingly, as we see here in this graph, basically showing how we see a huge decline in the labor income share as a percentage of GDP. And again, this situation has very differentiated impacts across the lines of gender and class and race, and it's felt differently for women in the global South versus the global North. So again, when we see this concentration of wealth revolving around the financial economy and less on the real economy, the burden that is shared by women increases. I don't know if I have. Do I still have time?
Un minuto más, Flora.
Okay. Yeah, I think the main message I was trying to make was that financialization increases the uncertainty and price volatility for food producers and consumers. It generates more precarious real economy jobs. And then at the same time, it will come and offer market-based solutions for the problems that it created in the first place. And this individualization of the solutions, so the reliance on private insurance schemes, the reliance on credit from commercial banks that come to mitigate the risks, actually create more debt and fail to deal with the root causes and the systemic dimensions of the problems. And so I think with my last slide, I try to give some entry points for more hope. So just some ideas here of where to move this discussion in terms of policy suggestions that could potentially deal with this issue. One is this regulation of the asset management industry. There's increasing discussions about a new financial transaction tax. We have the UN tax convention process that is advancing. There is this continuous call by civil society organizations and Latindadd included on debt cancellation and the UN debt workout mechanism. There's the issue of trade that is very key and that sadly I couldn't talk about in this presentation, but I think in general, a lot of these discussions are happening within the UN financing for development process, and I hope that we can keep discussing on this further. So thanks so much.
Thank you, Flora. Really interesting all what our panelists presented. And you've been through at least 10 policies, fiscal and debt policies, climate and energy policies, monetary, but health, education policies, labor, food policies, and agricultural policies, how the financialization has been in all those policies and becoming an obstacle to the rights. I wanted to now read the questions and comments that we have in the chat and in the Q&A box. And they're in English. I'm going to read them in Spanish. And then we'll have a second round to our panelists so that they can have some comments, because I believe that all comments and questions at some point they could be answered or commented about by any of our panelists. Maria says, making public goods to be investable. There are some deficiencies, as Daniela Gabor mentioned. Do you believe that a human rights perspective can help to counteract this narrative? Could tax justice offer a sustainable alternative to financialization to comply with human rights and climate justice? Laurie points that access to justice at all levels can increase access to financialization, at the same time that we increase justice between nations and states. Maybe they should be reinforced and confronting the colonial measures for justice between the states, including common responsibilities but differentiated. Financial institutions from UN should increase access to justice, providing voting power based on the ecological institutions. Financialization of carbon is about to disappear as we reduce carbon emissions. Individual access to justice can increase women's access to financialization. Women have a right to compensation and financial repairs. Marta says that we need to take time not only to define problems and today's and the future's topics in the framework of discussing financing for development. Marta says she firmly believes in the forgiven debt, but it also comes from she comes from farmers from Brazil, so she's aware of what they're doing. There are some ideas for a fair transition beyond the financial schemes. There are proposals and ideas to integrate in the process the voices of indigenous communities and farmer communities. Ia Merit points that what would be the advice of panelists to stop financialization of public goods and to really achieve a political change. Maybe in the same order in which you started, you can give some comments, or Daniela, Manuel, Elena, and Flora regarding these comments, or maybe you have 1 or 2 minutes and we'll be closing our event, which invites us to continue working on these issues. And it really went beyond our expectations and all the topics that were posed and how they were addressed. The financialization topics linked to so many other topics that we all work on a daily basis. Go on, Daniela. Thank you for all your questions and observations. I don't know if you listen to Daniela. I can't. Yes, you have to go to Spanish or original source. All right. I started giving you, and I want to say that even though I believe that the human rights approach is very important, I don't think it's the best position to think of and to act on and to have policy strategies, because we're speaking about financialization and this idea of bringing private capital. Why am I saying this? Because if we think how the World Bank came to this narrative that we have to move private capital, have to move financial capitals, any employee of the World Bank would say, of course, our approach is on human rights. We are really clear that sustainable development goals, I forgot how to say it in Spanish, the sustainable development goals are very important. They are a priority, and to achieve those, we need private financing. So with this approach, to me, which is equally important, we have to even go beyond. That has to do with thinking about the microfinancial conditions, which build and condition what we could do in terms of how the government complies their commitments with human rights. So changing this approach, it's not like leaving the human rights behind, but it's not like the entry point or analysis point, because this is like the liberal framework which allows us to have the same speech. And it could take us to have the same speech as the World Bank. They say without private financing, there's no human rights. It's possible because we don't have money. That's the essence of what they would say. So to me, it's more important to think about what kind of social contract we're being recreating between the government and the citizens when we shift the approach from those partnerships with the capital private. And I think Elena and everyone showed with so much detail that it's a pathway that it reduces human rights, and it's a pathway that creates really inequality, and it reinforces an distribution policy that favors private capital, not even the national capital. Thank you, Daniela. Manuel, do you want to add any comment? Thank you. First of all, I agree. I, first of all, I agree with Flora, Lena, and Daniela. I learned a lot with their contributions. They were really interesting. And about the questions, I I share and I understand Daniela's comment because I believe that would be like the difference between the framework, what the human rights has to do in fiscal policy that's been we've been advancing for the past years. For example, this human rights initiative and public policy, where my professor in the master's, Pedro Rossi, he's done some important contributions. This is an approach that goes beyond of of OECD's that I consider it may be a good start to understand and to change the logic that the fiscal policy dominates within the established framework in neoliberalism. I believe this is very important, which means a change regarding the perspective that we have of fiscal policy. Now, there are other aspects that could shift, like to mention them, because let's say in the most strict sense, I believe that financialization as this accumulation phenomenon has a quality. It's because it has a high capacity of resilience, has capacity of adequation. So it's not that it's a process that it simply could be done like to have the contrary effect to do a definancialization process. Of course, it's a phenomenon which is a little more complex, but I believe there are some elements that can indicate how other possibilities to go, at least with a greater regulation in new social contracts, even internationally. And I believe there's two aspects that were moved a lot lately. One is the consequence of climate crisis, as Daniela mentioned. There's been an international discussion, maybe not to the detailed level, but there's an international debate regarding reform of the international financial, about the role of the multilateral organizations like the IMF, World Bank, and but the functioning of multilateral banks, among other aspects that I believe that it could be at least an open debate that would allow to show the arguments that we have here within the public international debate table. The other aspect has to do something that I mentioned, to Flora mentioned, it has to do with all this issue regarding the discussion of global taxing, just and including where the United Nations open and space so that we could incorporate some elements that were out of the OECD agreements regarding the international taxation of platforms. And I believe that this is an opportunity that we have. And I'm going to say something about Colombia. We built this taxing for the Caribbean and Latin America for this space to negotiate international scopes, this kind of affairs that have to do with taxing, we have an important possibility at least to increase these essential elements. And a taxing system that's more just and equitable, fair. Thank you, Emmanuel. Very, very important to incorporate explicitly the taxing and the role that they have in this phenomenon. Lena, do you want to add a few words? And I
Enfim, eu quero dizer que eu sou bastante cética quanto à possibilidade da gente realmente reverter a dinâmica da financiarização.
this
O que está
moment, what's happening in the
acontecendo no
world
mundo
now
hoje, nesse momento, mostra a
in the international
debilidade da
community
comunidade internacional,
to
a
the weakness
debilidade
of the
das Nações
UN.
Unidas, a questão dos direitos humanos estão
It's really out
completamente
of any
fora de qualquer
priority.
prioridade.
I believe that
Enfim, eu acho
for the
que
past 3 years
nos
in
últimos
which the
30
left
anos em que a
in Latin
a
America
esquerda latino-americana e a social-democracia
democracy
europeia
started to
abraçaram a
embrace financialization, they
financiarização,
embraced
abraçaram o
neoliberalism, they brought
neoliberalismo,
this.
nos trouxe a isso.
And we
E a
need
gente precisa de muita radicalidade para
radical
poder mudar
changes.
isso. Eu não
I'm
estou
not
vendo. E
seeing
qual de
which of
nós que
us
hoje tem um
has
imóvel
a
que ele espera
asset
vai
that continues
continuar num
increasing
processo de
value in the
valorização
future?
futura?
We, the
Nós que
part
temos
of our
parte
pension
da
funds,
nossa
I don't have one, but
aposentadoria, eu não tenho,
the
mas
younger
os mais
people that
jovens
have
têm em fundos de
capitalization funds,
capitalização, em
fully
fully
funded
funded
accounts,
accounts.
who
Quem é que
wants to
quer
see
ver
a
uma
depreciation of their assets? No
depreciação dos
one.
seus ativos?
So
Ninguém. Então,
we
nós somos
today are
hoje
hostages of
reféns
a way
de
of
um modo
life
de vida
where financial
onde a
dominance
dominância
is not
financeira é não
only
só hegemônica, como ela
because it stops
nos
us from
priva
collective
de
universes,
universos
which
coletivos.
means
Quer dizer,
it's
alguém
good to have
falou, é bom
access,
ter o acesso
individual access,
individual.
anything
Qualquer
individual
coisa
will not
individual não
solve
vai
the
resolver
problem
o
because
problema,
it's
porque
precisely the
justamente
big
a
revolution
grande
of the
revolução dos anos,
20th
enfim, do
century, the
século
creation of
XX, a
collective
criação da
property
propriedade
through
coletiva
public funding,
através do fundo público,
which
que
is
fazia
the
com pessoas que não tinham propriedade de nada, os
workers,
trabalhadores,
because
pela
of their
sua
condition of
condição de
workers, they used
trabalhador,
to have
tinham
rights to
direito
benefit
a um benefício, a uma
a
aposentadoria, a uma
retirement, shared retirement, shared the
compartilhamento do
risks.
risco, na
When
medida que
those
tudo
became
isso se
individualized,
individualizou. E o que é
and
propriedade de
this
ativos? É a
individualization
individualização
made it
mais
more complex.
completa.
The
É
idea
a
that
ideia de que
I'm going
eu vou me
to
dar bem, eu vou
to
ter
tackle
condições de
risk,
enfrentar
future
riscos
risks,
futuros,
as
na medida
long
que
as
eu
I can
conseguir
get to
gerir
manage my
o
asset
meu
portfolio.
portfólio de
And this
ativos.
is what
E é isso que a
financialization created.
financiarização
So
criou.
we're
Então,
hostages of
nós somos
this.
reféns disso
I
tudo.
only see
Eu só
changes,
vejo
and
mudanças
if we
se a
could
gente conseguir
have a
estipular
horizon, collective horizon,
horizontes de
solutions,
coletivos,
for
de
example, like we
soluções,
see in
por
Latin
exemplo,
America,
como a gente vê
countries
hoje na
like
América Latina, em
Ecuador,
países como o
where
Equador,
communities, indigenous
onde as
communities,
comunidades
were
indígenas
able to
conseguiram impor
to
derrotas
go
às
against the
mineradoras, etc.,
mind sides,
fazendo valer
making their
o
rights,
direito
their
à
collective
propriedade
rights,
coletiva, à
public
consulta
consultation rights,
coletiva, tem que haver
because the
consulta,
population
a
has to
população tem que se
manifest.
manifestar, tem
The
que dizer o que é
population has to say
fundamental para
what's fundamental
ela.
for them.
O presidente Petro do
The
Equador
Petro
vem com
president from
propostas
Ecuador
também
came with
regionais a nível
regional collective
latino-americano,
proposals
coletivas,
of
de
overcoming
superação justamente
um,
enfim, da
of the
política
development
de
policy based
desenvolvimento com
on
base
carbon
no
reduction.
carbono,
We
mas
see
nós
that
vimos que o
Brazil
Brasil
gave a
deu uma
different
resposta
answer, and
distinta
especially
e,
we don't
sobretudo, a gente
have
não pode ter nenhuma
any
expectativa com relação ao Banco
answer
Mundial.
from the
Nós
World Bank.
sabemos
We
que o
know
Ajara
that
Banga, que é o atual
Baha, which is
presidente,
the
ele foi
current president,
20
he was the
anos
CEO of
CEO
MasterCard.
da
He was
Mastercard,
responsible
foi
for the
responsável
introduction of
pela
all
introdução de
the
todos
credit
os
and debit
cartões de
cards in
crédito e de
Africa.
débito na
And
África,
this is
que
a
levou a um processo de
process of
endividamento dramático,
dramatic
e
debt.
que durante a
And
reunião
that
do
in
G20 ele
2020,
convidou quem?
he
Os 15
invited the 15 CEOs
CEOs
of
da
BlackRock,
BlackRock, da
Vanguard,
Vanguard,
AXA,
da
which is
AXA,
the
que é a
greatest
maior
investment
fundo de
fund,
investimentos
private investment funds, the
privados,
greatest
né? O maior
investors from
investidor
Europe,
institucional
to
europeu,
sit on the
para
table
sentar
to
com ele, para
define
eles definirem
together
os rumos
the
do
next steps of
desenvolvimento
development
nas
for the next
próximas
2
duas
decades. I
décadas.
believe that
Então,
we're in a
acho que nós estamos numa
situation
situação muito
where we
difícil
need a
e só
radicalization
uma grande radicalização por
by the
parte dos
social
movimentos
movements,
sociais e das
and it's
lideranças
fundamental
fundamentalmente
progressive to have a progressive
progressistas
approach that
poderá
could
nos
take us
levar
to a
a ter um horizonte
horizon that
minimamente,
could be a little
enfim,
more
justo
fair in this
nessa
green transition
transição
and also
verde e também
guaranteeing
na garantia dos
our
nossos
fundamental
direitos
rights. Thank
fundamentais.
you.
Obrigada.
Obrigada, Lena.
Flora, if you want to close the event.
Flora, si quisieras cerrar el
Thank
evento.
you. It's really difficult to
Sí,
close the event, but I'll
gracias.
try.
Muy difícil cerrar el evento, pero voy a intentar. No, I agree so much with what the previous panelists have said right now. I think just briefly highlighting, I completely echo Daniela's answer to the entry point of human rights. I think, yes, it can be a helpful tool, but it can also very much feed into the liberal discourse of the World Bank and others in terms of wanting to fulfill human rights by then attracting more private capital. So I think it's a tricky tool that we need to be careful on how to use it. Yeah, fully support what Manuel said and what Lena just mentioned. Now, in terms of radicalization, is the only way forward and radicalization of social movements and of our demands. I cannot agree more. I think we're seeing yeah, and financialization just makes it more difficult because precisely it's a trend that pushes us towards this individual solutions. And so we kind of lose track of the systemic dimension. And so I think that, yes, we are, of course, in a crisis of multilateralism, and we see this challenge of balancing the power between spaces, more democratic spaces such as the UN, and the current oversized power of other spaces like the OECD or the World Bank and IMF. And so I think that we need to be more radical, and I think we also need to try to rebalance this power within the global financial architecture and global economic governance. So I think trying to bring this economic discussions and decision making to a completely, I mean, to far from perfect, but more democratic spaces such as the UN can be one way to do it. Yeah, I think there was some questions about tax justice. I think I responded a bit with the end of my presentation, but I also agree that this is definitely an important struggle to push for towards the definancialization on the other side. So basically, yeah, everything that we can do to take power away from this oversized financial sector and bring more transformation through the real economy and through more radical thinking of how our global economy could look like, I think is the way forward. Easier said than done, but I would love to keep pushing with others on this. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Flora.
We invite you for the next event on Thursday, 16th, and thank you for the generosity because you gave us so much information, so pedagogical in a complex topic, difficult to discuss. And so hopefully we can meet again at a different event. Thank you, Daniela, Manuel, Lena, Flora, and all those that participated.